"Can I cook for shelter?" The words escaped through chattering teeth as Delilah Turner collapsed against the ranch house door. Rain hammered the wooden planks above her head. Lightning split the sky, illuminating bruises that painted her dark skin in shades of purple and yellow. Thunder rolled across the vast Wyoming territory like distant cannon fire. The storm had been chasing her for 3 days, or maybe she had been running toward it. Hard to tell the difference anymore when every shadow held danger and every town held men with questions she couldn't answer. The door opened with a creak that cut through the wind. Warm light spilled onto the covered porch where Delilah knelt, soaked through to her bones. A tall man filled the door frame, broad shoulders blocking the glow from inside. His weathered face carried the kind of lines that came from squinting into sun and making hard choices. Silas McGraw had been working late again, poring over ledgers that never seemed to balance and letters that never brought the news he wanted. The Lazy Arrow Ranch demanded everything he had and then asked for more. Most nights, he fell asleep at his desk with ink-stained fingers and a head full of numbers that wouldn't add up right. He stared down at the woman on his porch. Her dress, once blue, had faded to the color of old bruises. Mud caked her bare feet, but it was her eyes that stopped him cold. They held the kind of fear that came from running out of places to run. "Ma'am," he stepped back, opening the door wider. "Get inside before this storm tears the roof clean off." Delilah tried to stand. Her legs betrayed her, buckling like green wood under too much weight. Silas caught her before she hit the porch boards, his calloused hands gentle despite their size. The touch of another human being after days of solitude nearly broke her. "Easy now." His voice carried the low rumble of distant thunder. "When's the last time you ate something?" She couldn't remember. Time had become liquid since her escape from the courthouse in Cheyenne. Days blurred into nights. Towns became smears of lamplight viewed from hiding spots in the brush. Food had been whatever she could find or steal when desperation outweighed caution. The interior of the ranch house wrapped around her like a warm blanket. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, flames dancing behind iron grating. Simple furniture spoke of function over comfort, everything worn but well-maintained, like its owner. Silas guided her to a chair near the fire. The heat sent shivers through her frame as warmth battled cold for control of her body. He disappeared into what she assumed was the kitchen, returning with a steaming mug that smelled of coffee and something stronger. "Drink this, slowly." The liquid burned going down but spread warmth through her chest. She wrapped both hands around the mug, letting the heat seep into her fingers. For the first time in days, the shaking stopped. "Those bruises look fresh." Silas settled into the chair across from her, keeping his distance but close enough to catch her if she fell again. "Someone did this to you." It wasn't a question. Men like Silas McGraw had seen enough of the world to recognize violence when it walked onto their porch in the middle of a storm. The marks on her arms told a story he'd heard too many times before. Delilah touched her split lip, a habit formed over the past week. "I can work. I'm a good cook. Better than good." "That wasn't what I asked. It's all I can offer." Outside, the storm raged with renewed fury. Wind howled around the corners of the house like something alive and angry. Rain drummed against the windows in sheets that turned the glass into moving water. Silas studied her face in the firelight. Something familiar lurked in her features, a nagging recognition that he couldn't quite place. Like seeing a half-remembered dream in daylight, the feeling sat heavy in his chest, mixing with other ghosts that never seemed to rest. "There's men looking for you." She flinched as if he'd struck her. The mug trembled in her hands, coffee sloshing dangerously close to the rim. "I saw them in town yesterday, professional types, not local law." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "The kind that get paid well for bringing people back. I won't bring trouble to your door." She started to rise, already calculating distances to the door, to the barn, to anywhere that wasn't here. "I'll be gone before sunrise. Sit down." The command carried enough authority to stop her mid-motion. She sank back into the chair, every muscle coiled for flight. Storm like this will kill you before morning. Even if it doesn't, you won't make it 2 miles in this mud. Silas stood and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. Besides, I could use a cook. Last 3 quit after tasting their own food. Hope flickered in her chest like a candle flame in wind. Dangerous to let it grow, but impossible to snuff out completely. Room and board for cooking. Fair trade. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Delilah closed her eyes and let the warmth seep deeper into her bones. For the first time since Cheyenne, she allowed herself to imagine staying in one place long enough to sleep through the night. Heavy boots on the porch announced another arrival. The door burst open, bringing wind and rain and a man who filled the frame with angry energy. Garrett Kane, the ranch foreman, shook water from his coat and froze when he saw Delilah. "Boss." His voice carried warning wrapped in false courtesy. "We got ourselves a situation here." Garrett Kane's boots left muddy prints across the hardwood floor. His eyes moved between Silas and Delilah, calculating angles and consequences. Water dripped from his hat brim onto the braided rug Silas's mother had made 20 years past. "She can't stay here, boss." Silas remained seated, but his spine straightened. Authority lived in stillness sometimes more than in movement. "My ranch, my decision, your reputation." Garrett pulled off his soaked coat, shaking it harder than necessary. "People talk, especially about this kind of hospitality." Delilah set down her mug with careful precision. The ceramic made no sound against the wooden table. She understood the language of men who spoke around her instead of to her. Her presence was the problem. Her humanity was irrelevant. The fire crackled between them, filling the silence with small violence. Sparks climbed toward the chimney, seeking sky they would never reach. Storms passing. Garrett moved to the window, though the rain still hammered glass. "Could clear by morning. Could." Silas's voice carried the weight of iron. "Won't." 3 days later, the storm had moved east, leaving behind mud that sucked at boot heels and air that tasted of rain and new grass. Delilah stood in the ranch kitchen before dawn, her hands working familiar magic with flour and lard, and the kind of intuition that couldn't be taught. The first biscuits emerged from the oven golden and steaming. She'd found salt pork in the pantry, eggs from the hen house, coffee beans that ground to powder between her palms. The kitchen began to smell like home, though she'd forgotten what that word meant. Ranch hands filtered in as the sun crested the eastern hills. They came hungry and suspicious, men who'd learned to judge strangers by the quality of their threats. Delilah kept her eyes down, her movements small and efficient. Let the food speak first. Tom Berkeley, barely 18 with hands that had never known anything but rope and leather, took the first bite. His eyes widened. The second bite followed faster than the first. "Jesus and Mary." He spoke around a mouthful of biscuit. "Ma'am, where'd you learn to cook food that doesn't taste like boot leather?" Others followed his lead. Plates emptied. Men asked for seconds before finishing firsts. The kitchen filled with the sound of forks against tin, and satisfaction that needed no words. Silas appeared in the doorway as the last ranch hand headed to morning chores. He surveyed the empty plates, the satisfied faces, the way his men moved with energy instead of resignation. "They'll work better today." Delilah scraped grease from the cast iron skillet. "Food matters. So does safety." She stilled. The scraping stopped. Outside, horses nickered in the corral and leather creaked against saddle horn. "I know the risks you're taking." "Do you?" The question hung between them, heavy with unspoken history. Silas moved closer, close enough to see the careful way she held her shoulders, the tension that never quite left her frame. "Tell me what you're running from. Does it matter?" "Might." She turned to face him. In daylight, her bruises had faded to yellow-green, but new ones might be harder to see. Fear lived in the space between words, in the way she positioned herself near exits, in how her hands stilled when boots approached. "Bad men do bad things. Good men sometimes let them." Silas nodded. The world was full of both kinds. He'd been both kinds depending on the day and the choice in front of him. That evening, 3 riders approached the ranch house. They moved with purpose, their horses fresh despite the long day. Delilah watched from the kitchen window as they dismounted, noting the way they spread out, the weight of weapons beneath their coats. Professional men. The kind Garrett had mentioned. She slipped out the back door and into the barn, finding shadow between hay bales that smelled of summer and safety. Through gaps in the wood, she watched Silas greet the strangers. "Help you gentlemen with something?" The leader, a thin man with pale eyes, removed his hat. Looking for someone. Colored woman about 30 might have come through asking for work. Lot of folks ask for work. This one's special. Reward for information leading to her whereabouts. Money changed hands. Not much, but enough to buy silence or betrayal, depending on a man's needs. Haven't seen anybody matching that description. The lie came easy, practiced. Silas had learned young that truth was a luxury good men couldn't always afford. After the riders left, Delilah emerged from her hiding place. Hay clung to her dress, and her hands shook despite her efforts to still them. They'll be back, probably. They stood in the gathering dusk, two people who understood that safety was temporary and trust was earned in increments too small to measure. That night, Delilah woke screaming. The sound echoed through the ranch house, raw and desperate. It spoke of things no person should witness, of running that never led to safety, of hands that hurt instead of helped. Silas found her in the kitchen, pressed against the wall like cornered prey, her eyes wide and unseeing, lost in some memory that played behind her lids. "You're safe." He kept his distance, his voice low and steady. "You're at the Lazy Arrow. No one's going to hurt you here." It took minutes for her breathing to slow, for recognition to return to her face. When it did, shame followed close behind. "I'm sorry." "Don't be." He handed her a cup of water, careful not to let their fingers touch. Trust was fragile as morning ice. One wrong move could shatter it beyond repair. "The dreams come most nights," she nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "They'll fade, eventually." "How do you know?" Silas looked toward the window, where darkness pressed against glass and wind carried the scent of distant rain. "Because they have to." In the days that followed, Delilah became part of the ranch's rhythm. She rose before dawn, filling the kitchen with warmth and the promise of food that nourished more than bellies. The ranch hands began timing their return by the smoke from her chimney. But Garrett Kane watched her with eyes that held calculation instead of acceptance. He made notes of her habits, her movements, the way she startled at unexpected sounds. One morning, he rode to town for supplies. When he returned, his saddlebags held more than flour and coffee. They held secrets that would change everything. Silas heard the words through the saloon's thin walls while loading supplies. Two men at the bar, voices low but urgent, speaking of things that made his blood run cold. Judge Crenshaw's offering good money for the woman, real good money. What'd she do? Saw something she shouldn't have. Something that could hang a man. The flour sack slipped from Silas's hands, hitting the wooden sidewalk with a soft thud. White powder leaked through burlap, staining the boards beneath his boots. Federal marshal came sniffing around the judge's business. Now that marshal's missing, and so's the witness who could tell what happened to him. Silas steadied himself against the hitching post. The wood was warm from afternoon sun, but his hands felt carved from winter stone. A federal marshal, missing. The timing crawled up his spine, cold and certain. His father had been a federal marshal, had been investigating corruption in territorial courts, had disappeared 18 months ago without trace or word. The pieces fell together with the sound of breaking glass. He loaded the remaining supplies with mechanical precision, his mind racing ahead to the ranch, to Delilah, to the truth that had been sleeping in his kitchen and sharing his table. She wasn't running from a bad marriage or debts or small-town trouble. She was running from murder. The ride home stretched endless as winter sky. Each hoofbeat pounded against the rhythm of his thoughts. Delilah had witnessed something terrible, something worth killing for. Something that involved federal marshals and judges and the kind of corruption that rotted through the territory's foundations. Something that might involve his father's disappearance. The ranch appeared through heat shimmer, buildings wavering against the horizon. Smoke rose from the kitchen chimney, straight and true in the still air. Delilah would be preparing supper, her hands working magic with whatever provisions she could find. Those same hands had seen violence, had seen justice murdered. Silas found her in the garden behind the house, tending tomato plants that struggled against the harsh soil. She looked up at his approach, shading her eyes against the late sun. Something in his face made her straighten, made her hands still against the green vines. "We need to talk." She followed him into the house without question, but her movements carried new tension. In the parlor, shadows gathered in corners despite the remaining daylight. Silas closed the door and turned to face her. Judge Bartholomew Crenshaw. The name hit her like a physical blow. She stepped backward, her hand reaching for the wall, for something solid in a world that had suddenly tilted sideways. "You know that name." Not a question. Her reaction had already provided the answer. "How long have you known?" "Since today." Silas moved closer, careful not to corner her, not to trigger the flight response that lived just beneath her skin. "Heard men talking in town, about a witness, about a missing federal marshal." Delilah's breathing quickened. The walls seemed to press inward, stealing air from the room. "What was the marshal's name?" "I don't know." The lie came automatically, born from 18 months of keeping secrets. But something in her eyes, some recognition or shared pain, cracked his resolve. "McGraw, Thomas McGraw." Her legs gave out. She sank into the nearest chair, her face draining of color. He had kind eyes. The words barely whispered past her lips, but they landed in Silas's chest with the force of thunder. Everything inside him went still and sharp and dangerously focused. "You knew him." "He came to the courthouse. Said he was investigating Judge Crenshaw's land deals. Said people were being cheated, maybe worse." She stared at her hands, folded tight in her lap. "I worked in the courthouse kitchen. Heard things. Saw things." "What things?" The question hung between them, heavy with the weight of truth that would change everything. Outside, wind stirred the curtains, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. "Documents. Bills of sale for people who weren't slaves. Free papers that got burned. Money changing hands." Her voice grew smaller with each word. "Your father found out. Confronted the judge in his chambers." Silas gripped the back of a chair, his knuckles white against dark wood. "I was cleaning, heard shouting. When I looked through the door, your father was on the floor. The judge was standing over him with a poker from the fireplace." The room spun around him. 18 months of wondering, of hoping, of imagining his father alive somewhere and unable to return. All of it crashing down into the simple, brutal truth. Murder. "He saw me watching, started yelling for his men. I ran." She looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I'm sorry, I should have tried to help, should have done something." "You did do something." His voice came from somewhere deep and raw. "You survived. You're the only witness. The only one who can hang him." They sat in silence as darkness gathered outside. The weight of shared truth settled between them, heavy and binding. She had seen his father die. He had given her sanctuary. Neither had known the threads that connected their separate griefs. "Why didn't you tell me before? Would you have believed me? A colored woman accusing a territorial judge." She shook her head. "Would have gotten us both killed." The logic was sound and bitter. Justice was a luxury that depended on the color of your skin and the weight of your purse. His father had learned that lesson too late. "The men who came here, they work for him. Bounty hunters, trackers, men who ask no questions as long as the pay's good." Silas stood and walked to his desk, pulling out a strongbox he kept locked away from curious eyes. Inside lay letters, documents, everything he'd gathered about his father's disappearance. Evidence that had led nowhere until now. "I've been hunting for answers for 18 months. He spread the papers across the desk, maps and witness statements and correspondence that painted a picture of corruption reaching through multiple territories. Judge Crenshaw's name appeared in margins and footnotes, always careful, always protected. All this time, the truth was sitting at my table. Delilah approached the desk, her eyes scanning the documents. Recognition flickered across her face as she saw names, dates, places that connected to her own experience. You're building a case against him. Was trying to, never had enough proof. Now you do. He looked at her, really looked. Not the frightened woman who'd collapsed on his porch, but someone who carried justice in her hands and steel in her spine despite everything that had tried to break her. Now we do. Outside, a horse approached the ranch house. Single rider, moving fast. Silas moved to the window, his hand instinctively moving toward the rifle above the mantel. Garrett Kane dismounted near the porch, his face grim in the lamplight spilling from the windows. He looked toward the house, then back toward the horizon where dust still hung in the air. When he knocked, the sound echoed through the house with the finality of judgment. "Boss, we got company coming. The kind that don't take no for an answer." Garrett stepped inside, his boots heavy against the hardwood. His eyes moved between Silas and Delilah, taking in the scattered documents, the tension that filled the room like smoke. "How much time do we have?" "Hour, maybe 2 if we're lucky." Silas gathered the papers from his desk, his movements quick and efficient. Each document represented months of careful investigation, fragments of truth that pointed toward something larger and more dangerous than simple corruption. "Who's coming?" Garrett's jaw tightened. Judge Crenshaw himself brought a dozen men, professional types with badges that might even be real. The words settled over them like dust after a stampede. Delilah moved toward the window, her fingers gripping the curtain edge. In the distance, lamplight flickered through the darkness, moving closer with each passing minute. "They know she's here." Silas looked at his foreman, studying the man's face in the lamplight. Something had shifted in Garrett's expression, something that spoke of choices made and prices paid. "How do they know?" Silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of approaching horses and the weight of betrayal. Garrett's hand moved to his hat, removing it with careful precision, his eyes unable to meet Silas's gaze. "Money talks loud when a man's got debts." The admission hit the room like a physical blow. Delilah stepped back from the window, her face pale but unsurprised. She'd learned long ago that survival often depended on recognizing the moment when allies became enemies. "How long have you been reporting to them?" "Since she arrived." Garrett's voice carried the hollow sound of a man who'd sold something he couldn't buy back. "Judge promised to clear my gambling debts. All I had to do was keep watch." Silas remained perfectly still, but something dangerous moved behind his eyes. Trust, once broken, left jagged edges that cut deep. "And now I'm telling you to run." Garrett replaced his hat, adjusting the brim with steady hands. "Because whatever they're paying me ain't worth watching good people die." Outside, the sound of horses grew louder. Voices carried on the night air, rough men discussing plans that didn't include mercy or second chances. Delilah moved away from the window, her mind already calculating distances and possibilities. The back door led to the barn. The barn led to open country. Open country led to running again, always running, until her legs gave out or her luck ran dry. "There's another way." Silas pulled a leather satchel from beneath his desk, filling it with documents and correspondence. His movements carried purpose, the deliberate actions of a man who'd been preparing for this moment without knowing it. "We don't run, we fight back." He moved to a cabinet in the corner, withdrawing packets wrapped in oilcloth. Each packet contained copies of the evidence spread across his desk, carefully prepared and addressed to different territories. Federal marshals in Denver, Santa Fe, and Fort Collins. Newspaper editors in 3 territorial capitals. Territorial governors who might still care about justice. Delilah stared at the packets, understanding dawning in her eyes. "You've been planning this. Been hoping for enough evidence to make it stick. Now we have it." The sound of horses stopped outside the ranch house. Boots hit the ground, followed by the jingle of spurs and the soft click of weapons being checked. Men spreading out, surrounding the building, cutting off escape routes. "They won't let us leave alive." "They don't have to." Silas handed packets to both Delilah and Garrett. "Tom Berkeley's waiting at the line shack with fresh horses. He'll carry these to the territorial capital." Garrett hefted the packet, feeling its weight. What about the judge's men? Let them come. We'll give them what they expect to find. Understanding passed between the three of them without words. Sometimes the best way to win was to let the enemy think they'd already won. Sometimes survival meant sacrifice. A heavy knock echoed through the house, followed by a voice that carried authority backed by force. "McGraw, we know she's in there. Send her out and nobody gets hurt." Silas looked at Delilah, memorizing her face in the lamplight. The frightened woman who'd collapsed on his porch had been replaced by someone harder, someone who understood that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. "You sure about this?" She nodded, her hands steady despite everything. "Your father died trying to stop him. We finish what he started." The knock came again, harder this time, rattling the door in its frame. Outside, men moved through the darkness, positioning themselves for assault or siege, depending on the response they received. "Last chance, McGraw." Silas opened the door. Judge Bartholomew Crenshaw stood on the porch, flanked by men whose faces carried the cold efficiency of professional killers. The judge was smaller than Silas had expected, a thin man with pale eyes and hands that had never known honest work. "Judge." Silas stepped aside, gesturing toward the interior. "Come in. We've been expecting you." Crenshaw entered with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. His eyes swept the room, taking in the furniture, the fireplace, the woman standing near the back wall with her hands folded and her head high. "Miss Turner, you've led us quite a chase." Delilah met his gaze without flinching. "Not far enough, apparently. Far enough to cause considerable trouble, but that ends tonight." The judge's men filed into the room, their presence turning the comfortable space into something cold and threatening. Weapons remained holstered, but hands rested near gun butts with practiced ease. "What exactly do you think she's done?" Crenshaw turned toward Silas, studying the rancher with eyes that missed nothing. "Theft, destruction of property, fleeing lawful custody. That all? That's enough." The conversation carried the weight of things unspoken, truths that everyone in the room understood but no one dared voice. Murder was a hard word to say aloud, especially when the speaker was guilty of it. "She's been working here, earning her keep, causing no trouble. Nevertheless, she needs to come with us." Territorial law. Delilah stepped forward, her movement drawing every eye in the room. She'd made her choice, accepted the consequences, prepared herself for whatever came next. "I'll come quietly. No need for trouble." But trouble was already there, woven into the fabric of the moment, waiting in the shadows where Tom Berkeley rode hard toward the territorial capital with evidence that could hang a judge and free the innocent. The real battle was just beginning. Judge Crenshaw moved toward Delilah with the measured steps of a man collecting property. His pale eyes held the cold satisfaction of a hunter who'd finally cornered elusive prey. Behind him, his men shifted weight from foot to foot, hands never straying far from their weapons. "Shackles won't be necessary if you cooperate." Delilah straightened her shoulders, meeting his gaze with quiet defiance. "I said I'd come quietly." "Good. Sheriff Morrison will escort you back to Cheyenne for trial." A new voice cut through the tension from the doorway. "I'm afraid that won't be possible." Sheriff Morrison stepped into the lamplight, his badge catching the glow. But something had changed in his weathered face, something that made Judge Crenshaw's confidence flicker. "What do you mean?" Morrison removed his hat, revealing gray hair dampened with sweat despite the cool evening. His eyes found Delilah, then moved to Silas, carrying a weight that spoke of difficult decisions made in the darkness between towns. "Federal marshals are waiting in Cheyenne. Seems they've got questions about your land dealings, Judge. Questions about missing persons and forged documents." The words hit the room harder than gunfire. Crenshaw's men looked between their employer and the sheriff, calculating new odds, measuring their loyalty against their survival. "That's impossible." Evidence packets arrived this morning. 3 different territorial capitals, all containing the same information. Witness statements, financial records, bills of sale for people who were never slaves. Silas felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen. Tom Berkeley had made it through. The evidence was spreading faster than wildfire, carried by honest men to places where Judge Crenshaw's influence couldn't reach. This woman is a fugitive, a criminal. This woman is a federal witness under territorial protection. Morrison's voice carried new authority, backed by laws that superseded local corruption. My orders are to ensure her safe passage to Denver for testimony. Crenshaw's facade began to crack, revealing the desperate man beneath the judicial robes. His eyes darted between the sheriff, his own men, and the door that suddenly seemed very far away. "You're making a mistake, Morrison, a career-ending mistake." "Maybe, but it's my mistake to make." The sheriff's transformation reminded Silas of ice breaking on a winter river, sudden and irreversible. Morrison had chosen his side, abandoning a corrupt master for something that might still resemble justice. One of Crenshaw's hired guns stepped forward, his hand moving toward his weapon. "Judge, we could handle this quiet-like." "No," the word came from Garrett Kane, who positioned himself between the gunman and Delilah. "Too many witnesses, too many questions." The betrayer had become protector, redemption wearing the face of a man who'd found his conscience too late but not too late to matter. "Besides," Silas added, his voice carrying the calm of a man who'd already won, "killing a federal witness under territorial protection would bring the kind of attention that even judges can't buy their way out of." Outside, horses approached at a gallop. Multiple riders, moving fast through the darkness. Crenshaw's men tensed, hands dropping to gun butts, but Sheriff Morrison raised his hand. "Those would be my deputies, and a few federal marshals who decided not to wait in Cheyenne." The sound of boots on the porch preceded the arrival of 6 armed men wearing badges that carried real authority. They filed into the house with professional efficiency, surrounding Crenshaw's group without drawing weapons. The lead marshal, a tall man with graying temples and eyes that had seen too much, stepped forward. "Judge Bartholomew Crenshaw, you're under arrest for murder, conspiracy, and violations of federal territory law. This is outrageous. I'm a territorial judge." "Not anymore." The words carried finality, justice arriving on horseback under a star-filled sky. Crenshaw's men found themselves outnumbered and outgunned, their employer's influence evaporating faster than morning dew. One by one, they stepped away from the judge, hands raised, weapons surrendered. Hired loyalty had limits, and those limits ended when federal marshals started making arrests. "You have no proof. This woman's testimony is worthless. The word of a colored woman against a territorial judge." The lead marshal smiled, a cold expression that held no warmth. "The word of a federal witness, corroborated by financial records, witness statements, and physical evidence recovered from your courthouse, including a blood-stained poker from your office fireplace." Delilah's intake of breath was barely audible, but Silas heard it. Justice for his father, delayed but not denied, arriving in the form of evidence carefully preserved and testimony courageously given. "Marshal Thomas McGraw was investigating your operation when you killed him. His son has been continuing that investigation for 18 months. All eyes turned to Silas, who stood straighter despite the weight of grief and vindication warring in his chest. His father's death would be avenged through law rather than violence, through truth rather than revenge. The woman has rights under territorial law, protection as a federal witness, compensation for her testimony, and safe passage to wherever she chooses to go after the trial. Freedom." The word hung in the air between them, precious as water in drought. Delilah could leave, could disappear into the vast territories where Judge Crenshaw's influence couldn't reach, could start over with a new name in a new place where no one knew her history. But she looked at Silas, at the ranch hands gathering in the doorway, at the life she'd begun to build in the shadow of danger. Freedom meant choice. Choice meant staying as much as leaving. "I'd like to see this through, see justice done properly," the marshal nodded. "That's your right, ma'am. We'll need your testimony in Denver, then you're free to go where you please." As they led Judge Crenshaw away in shackles, his pale eyes promised retribution that would never come. His corruption had been exposed, his network dismantled, his victims finally granted the justice they'd been denied. Sheriff Morrison lingered as the others departed, his hat in his hands and shame written across his weathered face. "I should have acted sooner, should have seen what was happening." "You acted when it mattered," Silas replied. "That's what counts." The sheriff nodded and followed the marshals into the darkness, leaving behind the silence of a storm finally past. 6 months after Judge Bartholomew Crenshaw's conviction, autumn painted the Wyoming Territory in shades of gold and rust. The Lazy Arrow Ranch had settled into rhythms that felt permanent, grounded in earth that no longer trembled beneath the weight of secrets. Delilah stood at the kitchen window, watching steam rise from her morning coffee. The view had become familiar, comforting in ways she'd forgotten were possible. Rolling hills stretched toward mountains that caught the sunrise and held it, painting the sky in colors that changed with each passing day. Her testimony in Denver had lasted 3 days. She'd spoken truth into a courtroom filled with men who listened, who took notes, who treated her words as evidence rather than entertainment. Judge Crenshaw had been sentenced to hang, his network of corruption dismantled piece by careful piece. 47 people had been freed from illegal bondage, families reunited, lives restored. The kitchen door opened behind her, bringing the scent of hay and horses and honest work. Silas entered with the quiet movements of a man who understood that mornings required gentleness, that the day's burdens would arrive soon enough without invitation. "Coffee's ready." He poured himself a cup, standing beside her at the window. Their shoulders didn't touch, but the space between them hummed with comfortable familiarity. 6 months of shared meals, shared work, shared silence had built something stronger than passion, more lasting than desire. "Tom's bringing the new family today." Delilah nodded. The Hendersons had written from Kansas, another family displaced by violence, seeking sanctuary in a territory that promised fresh starts. The ranch had become something neither she nor Silas had planned, a way station for souls seeking redemption. 3 children this time. Kitchens big enough. It always was, somehow. Delilah's cooking stretched to feed whoever needed feeding, her pantry expanding to match her generosity. The ranch hands had learned to set extra places without being asked. Garrett Kane appeared in the doorway, hat in hand, the gesture of a man still earning forgiveness. His gambling debts had been paid through honest work rather than betrayal, his redemption measured in daily choices to do better than the day before. "Ma'am." "Boss, riders coming up the valley." They gathered on the porch to watch the small wagon train approach. Tom Berkeley rode point, his young face weathered by responsibility and purpose. Behind him rolled 2 wagons carrying families, whose faces bore the familiar marks of people who'd traveled far to escape what they couldn't change. The Hendersons climbed down from the lead wagon with the careful movements of those who'd learned not to trust safety too quickly. The father, a broad man with calloused hands, surveyed the ranch buildings with eyes that measured escape routes before comfort. His wife gathered their children close, 3 small faces that had seen too much of the world's cruelty. But when Delilah approached with warm bread wrapped in clean cloth, the youngest smiled with the resilience of innocence not yet fully stolen. "Welcome to the Lazy Arrow." The simple words carried weight beyond their meaning. Welcome meant sanctuary. Welcome meant belonging. Welcome meant the possibility of home for those who'd forgotten what that word felt like. Over the following weeks, the ranch expanded in ways that had nothing to do with acreage. The Henderson children's laughter echoed from the barn where they helped with chores. Their mother's voice joined Delilah's in the kitchen, sharing recipes and stories that wove new patterns into the fabric of daily life. Other families followed. Word spread through networks of necessity. Whispered recommendations passed between those who lived on society's margins. The Lazy Arrow became known as a place where questions weren't asked, but help was freely given. Silas found himself managing not just cattle and crops but human hopes, coordinating with territorial authorities to provide legal protections for families rebuilding their lives. His correspondence with federal marshals had evolved from seeking justice to ensuring it remained available for others. One evening, as October painted the hills in deeper shades of amber, Delilah and Silas walked the fence line that marked the ranch's eastern boundary. The work was unnecessary, the fence sound, but the ritual had become important, a way of marking territory that belonged to them both. The Washingtons want to stay through winter. Good. Their boys got away with horses. They paused at a gate that opened onto vast grassland, country that stretched unbroken toward horizons that promised endless possibilities. The wind carried the scent of distant snow, winter's approach written in the air itself. Sometimes I think about that night, the storm that brought me here. Silas turned to study her profile in the fading light. 6 months had softened the sharp edges of fear, replaced wariness with something approaching peace. She'd grown into the safety he'd offered, made it her own. Regret it? Never. The word carried certainty, the weight of a choice made and owned completely. She'd had opportunities to leave, offers of positions in distant cities where her past wouldn't follow. But home was more than geography, more than the absence of danger. Home was belonging somewhere that belonged to you in return. As they walked back toward the ranch house, lights began appearing in windows. Families gathering for evening meals, children being called in from play, the simple rhythms of life lived without fear. Delilah paused at the kitchen door, looking back toward the hills where stars were beginning to emerge. 6 months ago, she'd collapsed on this porch with nothing but desperation and a desperate plea for shelter. Now she stood as partner and protector, her hand steady on the door handle, her future as vast and promising as the Wyoming sky. The frightened woman who'd run through storms had been replaced by someone who created sanctuary for others still running. Inside, the kitchen waited with its warmth and familiar scents, with coffee that never ran cold and bread that always seemed to multiply. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new families seeking refuge, new opportunities to choose courage over comfort. But tonight, there was peace. There was home. There was the quiet satisfaction of work that mattered, of lives rebuilt from fragments, of justice served with mercy on the side. The Lazy Arrow Ranch stretched under starlight, a beacon of hope in country that demanded toughness, but rewarded those who refused to let hardship steal their humanity. And in its kitchen, Delilah Turner McGraw prepared for tomorrow's challenges with hands that had learned to create comfort from chaos, love from loss, and home from the simple act of feeding those who hungered for more than just food. And that is all to the story for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. And if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.